Night of November 13th, 1974, began like any other late autumn evening in the quiet, tree-lined village of Amityville, Long Island. The Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue, with its distinctive quarter-moon windows staring out from the attic, like two vacant eyes, sat dark and silent. But inside, at approximately 3:15 a.m., the silence was shattered by the roar of a .35 caliber Marlin lever action rifle. Ronald DeFeo Jr., the 23-year-old son of the household, had just methodically murdered his entire family. He walked from room to room, first targeting his parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise, in their master bedroom. They were shot in the back, twice each while they slept. He then moved to the rooms of his siblings, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and 9-year-old John Matthew. Each was killed with a single shot. By the time the bodies were discovered the following evening, the community was in shock. Ronald Jr.'s initial story, that a mob hitman named Louis Fellini was responsible, quickly fell apart under police interrogation. He eventually confessed, but his explanation offered no solace. He claimed to hear voices in his head, plotting against his family. "Once I started," he later told investigators, "I couldn't stop. It all happened so fast." The house at 112 Ocean Avenue sat vacant for the next year, a grim monument to a tragedy no one wanted to remember. Its rooms held the ghosts of 6 people, and its walls seemed to absorb the silence left behind. In December 1975, a young couple named George and Kathleen Lutz purchased the home for a mere $80,000, a price significantly reduced due to its bloody history. They were looking for a fresh start, a beautiful home for their blended family of 3 young children. They moved in on December 18th, just days before Christmas. They would stay for only 28 days. December 18th, 1975, Amityville, New York. The moving truck pulled away from 112 Ocean Avenue, its diesel exhaust pluming white in the December chill. George Lutz, a sturdy 29-year-old with a Marine's discipline, stood on the porch of his new home and allowed himself a moment of pride. Beside him, Kathy watched the children, Daniel, Christopher, and Missy, race across the frozen lawn, their breath crystallizing in the air. It was a picture of American promise. They had known about the murders, of course. The real estate agent had been legally obligated to tell them. But George, a former officer in the Merchant Marine, was a practical man. He believed in facts, in things he could touch and see. The horror that had happened here was a human horror, a crime of flesh and blood, not phantom. That was someone else's tragedy. This was their future. The house itself was imposing. A 3-story Dutch colonial built in 1925, it sat on a sprawling property that sloped down to the Amityville River. It had 5 bedrooms, a boathouse, and an in-ground pool. For a family that had been living in a cramped apartment, it was a palace. The previous owner, John Moynihan, had named it High Hopes, a sign that once hung by the driveway. But the DeFeos, the family before the Lutzes, had lived here for 9 years, and Ronald DeFeo Sr. had hung a different sign, a wooden plaque that simply said, High Hopes. It was a small irony that George would only understand much later. That first night, as the family settled in, Kathy went to tuck the youngest, Missy, into bed. The child pointed to the corner of the room. "Who's that lady?" she asked, her voice small and unconcerned. Kathy turned. There was nothing there. She smiled, kissed her daughter, and turned off the light. It was easy to dismiss. Children had imaginary friends. It was nothing. December 19th, 1975. 2:15 a.m. George was jolted awake by a sound he couldn't place. He lay still in the darkness of the master bedroom, The same room where Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise had been shot in their sleep. Just 13 months earlier, the house was silent. He was about to close his eyes when he heard it again. A thump, heavy and deliberate, coming from the first floor. Then another. It sounded like someone was moving the heavy wooden furniture in the living room. He reached for the baseball bat he kept by the bed. Kathy stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide. George crept down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The living room was exactly as they had left it. The couches were in place. The chairs were undisturbed. He checked the locks on the front door and the kitchen door. Both were bolted. He was about to head back upstairs when the back door suddenly slammed shut, a violent crack that shook the frame. No wind, no draft. Just the sound of a door closing itself. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, staring at the door until the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon. He told himself it was an old house. Settling. That's what old houses did. They settled. December 20th, 1975. Father Ralph J. Pecoraro, a tall, mild-mannered Franciscan priest, had been a friend of the Lutz family for years. When George called and asked him to bless the house, he agreed without hesitation. It was a common request, especially for a home with such a dark past. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, carrying his holy water and a small crucifix. George led him through the house, room by room. The priest recited prayers, sprinkling the walls with water. When they reached the second-floor landing, he stopped. It was the room that had belonged to the DeFeo parents. Father Pecoraro later described it to investigators as a moment of profound unease. He raised his hand to bless the room, and a voice, clear, cold, and commanding, spoke directly into his ear. "Get out!" He spun around. George was 10 feet behind him, looking confused. There was no one else there. The priest felt a wave of nausea so powerful, he had to brace himself against the wall. He quickly completed the blessing, but his hands were shaking. As he left the house, he pulled George aside. "Don't use that room," he said, his voice low. "Don't go in there. And if you need anything, call me." He got in his car and drove away, leaving the Lutz family standing on the porch, a chill settling over them that had nothing to do with the winter air. That night, the atmosphere in the house changed. It became watchful. The family gathered in the living room trying to watch television, but the set suddenly cycled through a dozen channels on its own, stopping only on static. When George walked over to adjust it, the picture snapped back to normal, and a voice from the screen seemed to address him directly. A low, guttural murmur that he couldn't understand, but somehow knew was meant for him. Kathy began to smell something. At first it was faint, like old perfume. She traced it to the hallway bathroom. It grew stronger. It was the smell of Louise DeFeo's perfume, a scent she had never worn but recognized from the crime scene photos the police had shown them. It hung in the air like a presence, thick and cloying. December 23rd, 1975. Missy had become attached to a small imaginary friend she called Jody. At first it was charming, but then she started describing Jody in detail. Jody was a pig, a small pig with red eyes that followed her everywhere. She would talk to Jody in her room, and sometimes Kathy would hear a second voice answering, a low whispering sound that seemed to come from the walls. Daniel, the oldest, refused to sleep in his room. He said the windows were alive. He claimed the frames would warp and bend when he looked at them, the glass stretching like taffy before snapping back into place. George dismissed it as a child's nightmare until he saw it himself. He was walking past Daniel's room one night and caught a glimpse of the window in the reflection of a mirror. The frame was twisted, the glass bulging outward. He spun around to face it directly. It was perfectly normal. December 27th, 1975. Kathy woke up screaming. George ran into the bathroom to find her standing in front of the mirror, clutching her arms. There were small scratches on her chest and back, 4 parallel lines like claw marks. They were fresh, beading with blood. She hadn't done it to herself. She swore she had been standing there, washing her face, when she felt a burning sensation on her skin. In the mirror she had seen for just a split second, a pair of hands reaching around her from behind. Then nothing. That same night, George was in the living room when he heard marching band music. It was loud, a full brass section playing an old big band tune from the 1940s. He searched the house. The radios were off. The television was off. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. He ran upstairs to check on the children. They were all awake, huddled together in Missy's room. They could hear it too. The front door, which he had deadbolted, swung open. He slammed it shut and locked it. It swung open again. He stood there, holding it closed, his knuckles white, until the music finally faded away into silence. By now, the family was living in a state of constant terror. They slept in the same room, huddled together with the lights on. George, once the stoic pragmatist, began drinking heavily, trying to numb the fear that was corroding his sanity. Kathy was a ghost, dark circles under her eyes, her voice a whisper. She spent hours praying, clutching a rosary that seemed to offer no protection. January 6th, 1976. The winter had been mild, but on this night, the temperature dropped. George was checking the locks for the dozenth time when he noticed something on the wooden balustrade of the staircase. It was a bead of moisture. He touched it. It was sticky, and it left a dark, viscous smear on his fingers. He looked up. The substance was oozing from the walls, a greenish-black slime that crept down the plaster like sweat from a fever. The smell was indescribable, rotting meat and sulfur. It didn't just drip. It moved, defying gravity, pooling in corners and then retreating. Kathy found it in the kitchen, covering the countertops. They spent hours trying to clean it, but it would disappear on its own, only to reappear somewhere else, seeping from the light fixtures or the electrical outlets. It was as if the house was bleeding. That night, George had an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was in the living room, trying to stay awake, when he saw Kathy's teenage daughter from a previous relationship. Not one of the children who lived with them, but an older girl who was just visiting for the holidays, standing in the doorway. Her face was blank, expressionless. She began to walk toward him, but her movements were wrong. They were jerky, disjointed, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and she spoke in a voice that was not hers. It was a low, gravelly voice, ancient and angry. "George," it said, "you will not leave." He lunged for her, shaking her violently, and she collapsed in his arms, sobbing, with no memory of what had just happened. He realized then that it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was them. It had attached itself to them. January 12th, 1976. George had noticed it before, but dismissed it. A small door in the corner of the basement behind the oil tank. It was about 4 feet high, half the size of a normal door. He had assumed it was a crawl space or a utility closet. But on this night, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain, he decided to open it. He took a crowbar and pried it open. The hinges screamed. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending deeper into the earth. He had lived in the house for nearly a month and had no idea this existed. The stairs led to a room that wasn't on any blueprint, that the real estate agent had never mentioned. It was small, maybe 10 by 10, and it was painted entirely red. The walls were red, the ceiling was red, the floor was red. In the center of the room sat a single empty chair. The air was thick and warm, like a breath. George stood at the threshold, and he felt a presence so malevolent, so absolute, that his mind nearly shut down. It was looking at him. It was waiting. He slammed the door and fled, his legs barely carrying him back up the stairs. He didn't tell Kathy what he had found until the next day. They agreed, without speaking, that they would never go down there again. January 14th, 1976, 6:00 p.m. The final night began like any other. The children were anxious. Kathy was jumpy. George was pacing, a man at the end of his rope. He was supposed to go to a meeting that evening, but he couldn't bring himself to leave them alone. He sat in the living room, staring at the fire. At around 8 p.m., the temperature in the house began to drop. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was a plunge, as if someone had opened a door to a freezer. The fire in the fireplace, which had been roaring, shrank to a flicker, and then died, leaving only cold ash. The lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into absolute darkness. Then the sounds began. It wasn't just knocking or footsteps. It was a cacophony. Furniture being thrown across rooms upstairs, glass shattering, a choir of voices whispering, chanting, screaming. Kathy clutched the children in the living room, covering their ears. George grabbed a flashlight and ran upstairs. What he saw in the master bedroom stopped him cold. The dresser, a solid oak piece that weighed over 200 pounds, was levitating. It hung in the air, 3 feet off the ground, rotating slowly. He watched it for what felt like an eternity before it crashed to the floor with a deafening crack. He ran back downstairs. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." They didn't pack. They didn't take clothes or toys or photographs. They grabbed their coats and the children and ran for the door. As George pulled it open, he looked back. The front window was glowing red, pulsing like a heartbeat. On the stairs, he saw a figure. It was hooded like a monk, but where its face should have been, there was only a void, a blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the flashlight. It raised a hand, pointing at them. George slammed the door behind them, and they ran to the car. He didn't look back. He started the engine and floored it, the tires spinning on the frozen gravel. They drove for hours, not speaking, not stopping, until they reached Kathy's mother's house in Long Island. It was only then, in the safety of a normal home, that George finally broke down and wept. They never went back. If you enjoy our stories and want to experience more chilling, mysterious, and unforgettable tales, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything to us. By subscribing, you become part of our growing horror community and help us continue bringing you deeper, darker, and more thrilling stories. We would also love to hear from you. If you have experienced something strange, unexplained, paranormal, or truly terrifying in your own life, share your story with us through our email. The email address is provided in the channel bio. Send us your real experiences, and we may feature your story in one of our upcoming videos, with full credit in your name. Your story could be the next one that keeps thousands awake at night.